The airplane was quiet at first, filled with the normal sounds of people settling in their seats, the hum of engines, and the soft announcements from the crew. An elderly woman sat by the window, her breathing already a little heavy. She clutched her bag close. Inside it her small inhaler that she always carried for her asthma. To her, it was not just medicine, it was her lifeline. She looked out at the clouds, trying to stay calm, but something about the air in the cabin made her chest feel tighter than usual. Her son sat beside her, tall and calm, his eyes scanning the passengers and the crew. He looked younger than his mother, but there was something in his face, a quiet strength that made people notice. He had seen the world in ways most people could not imagine, though no one on the plane yet knew who he really was. For now he was just another passenger, a loyal son keeping his mother safe on a long journey. A flight attendant came down the aisle, checking bags and speaking with passengers. Her face was sharp, her voice strict, and when she saw the small inhaler in the old woman's hand, her eyes narrowed. She stopped, bent forward, and pointed at it. "What is this?" she asked firmly. The old woman tried to answer, her voice weak from shortness of breath. It's my medicine. My inhaler." But the attendant frowned and shook her head. "Not allowed," she said coldly, her hand already reaching out. Before anyone could stop her, she snatched the inhaler away, her voice echoing through the cabin. "These are not medicines. These are dangerous. They look like street drugs." The old woman gasped, her hand pressed to her chest as if the air itself had betrayed her. Around them, passengers began to whisper, shocked at what they were seeing. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath. A young woman behind them gasped. Even the crew nearby seemed uncertain, but no one moved to stop the attendant. The son turned slowly to face her, his eyes steady, unblinking. His voice was calm, almost too calm as he spoke. "That is my mother's inhaler. Without it, she cannot breathe." But the attendant only shook her head again, her hand gripping the inhaler tightly. "This is against policy. If you want to fly, you follow the rules." The mother coughed, her body trembling as she tried to breathe. Each sound of her struggling chest echoed louder than the engines. The son reached for her hand, holding it tightly, his jaw tightening. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the rows like a warning. "You don't understand what you are doing." The whispers among the passengers grew louder. Now, some were outraged, others confused, but no one dared to stand up. They all looked between the old woman fighting for air and the son sitting so still, his eyes burning with something deep and dangerous. The mother leaned against her seat, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, please, I need it." Her voice was desperate, cracking with pain. The passengers felt the weight of her words, but the flight attendant only held the inhaler higher, as if showing her authority. The son's hand slowly clenched into a fist, then released again. His calm face hid storms of anger inside him, storms he had once promised never to let loose in front of humans again. But watching his mother suffer, listening to her shallow gasps, something inside him stirred. It was not just anger. It was something far greater, something older, something no one else on that plane could understand. For a moment, the air inside the cabin seemed heavier, pressing down on everyone. The hum of the engines felt distant, as if the entire plane was sinking into silence. The son's eyes shifted, glowing faintly, just for a second, before dimming again. No one noticed, except one man 2 rows back, who blinked and rubbed his eyes, unsure if what he had seen was real. The old woman coughed again, clutching her chest harder, her breaths now coming in small gasps. She turned to her son, her eyes wide with fear, and whispered again, "Please, don't let me die like this." Her words cut deeper than any blade. The son leaned closer, his voice steady but filled with hidden power. "You will not die. Not today. Not because of them." Passengers Around them felt a chill, though they did not understand why. Something in his voice carried a force beyond human. It was as if the very walls of the plane leaned closer to listen. The attendant stiffened, her grip on the inhaler trembling for the first time. She tried to stand taller, her authority like armor, but she could not shake the weight of his gaze. For the first time since boarding, she felt fear. And then the sun stood up. The air inside the plane changed instantly. Every eye turned to him, and every whisper fell silent. His shadow stretched longer than it should have in the narrow aisle, and though his movements were calm, something in them carried the promise of a storm that no one would be able to escape. Old woman tried to call his name, her voice weak, but he only placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He looked forward, his voice steady as he spoke again. This time not only to the flight attendant, but to the entire plane. No one touches my mother's life and walks away unchanged. Asterisk, the sun stood in the narrow aisle, towering above the seats. His movements were not rushed, but deliberate, each step like the beat of a drum that everyone could hear in their chest. The passengers stared in silence, unsure if they were watching the man or something far greater. The flight attendant tried to stay firm, holding the inhaler tightly as if it were proof of her control. But her hand shook now, the mask of confidence, slipping away as the sun's eyes fixed on her. His gaze was not angry, but cold, and that coldness was worse than any rage. It was the calm before a storm. "Sit down, sir," the attendant said, forcing her voice to stay sharp. "Or I will have security waiting for you when we land." Her words meant nothing. The sun did not move back. Instead, he took another step forward, his shadow stretching over her. The other crew members froze in place, unsure whether to intervene. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, breathless, as if watching a play where the actors had forgotten their lines. The old woman coughed again, her body shaking with every shallow breath. She tried to reach for her son, whispering his name, but her strength was fading. Every second without her inhaler dragged her closer to the edge. The son's voice cut through the tension, low and steady. "Give it back now, for a moment." The attendant considered obeying. Something inside her screamed at her to hand it over. But pride and fear twisted together inside her, and she shook her head. "You are threatening me. This is against the law." Passengers began to murmur, louder now, voices of anger and disbelief rising. A man shouted from the back, "She needs her medicine. Are you blind?" A woman added, "This is cruel." The murmurs grew, spreading like fire, but still no one moved to stop the attendant. Fear kept them pinned to their seats. The son took one more step closer. His presence filled the aisle, his voice dropping lower, carrying a strange weight that pressed against everyone's chest. "This is not a threat. This is a warning. Return her medicine, or this flight will not continue." The attendant's breath caught in her throat. She tried to laugh, but it came out thin and nervous. "You can't stop this flight." The son tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. The lights above flickered, just once, as if the plane itself had heard him. Passengers gasped, some looking up at the ceiling, others staring at the sun with wide eyes. He had not moved his hands, had not touched anything, yet something in the air changed with him. The mother's voice, weak and trembling, broke the silence. "Please, don't fight. Just let it go." She wanted peace, not chaos, even as her chest burned for air. But the son shook his head gently, his hand brushing her shoulder. "You are my mother. Without you, there is no peace." The words struck deep in the hearts of the passengers. Many thought of their own families, their mothers, their loved ones. The injustice of the moment burned brighter inside them, but they remained silent, waiting for what the son would do next. The attendant's fingers tightened around the inhaler. She tried to raise her voice again, but it cracked under the weight of the silence. "If you don't sit down, we'll turn this plane around." The son's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, though it carried no warmth. Good, turn it around. Because no one here moves another mile until my mother breathes again. His words echoed across the cabin, powerful and unshakable. For the first time, passengers felt like they were not on a plane but inside a battlefield. With one man standing against an entire system, the old woman gasped again, her chest rising weakly, her eyes pleading. The son leaned closer, whispering something only she could hear. Her fear softened, just a little, as if his words carried a strength that wrapped around her like a shield. The attendant tried to step back, but the aisle was narrow, and the son's presence was too large to escape. Her authority, her training, none of it mattered now. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the cabin felt it. A child in the back began to cry. A man prayed under his breath. And in the cockpit, the pilots were already receiving alerts from the cabin crew. They did not yet know what was happening, but the tremor in the attendant's voice when she radioed them told them it was something serious. The son stood tall, calm but unyielding. His voice rang out once more, final and unshakable. This flight belongs to me now, until justice is done. The cabin fell into silence again, every passenger hanging on the edge of the unknown. The engines roared outside, but inside, all that mattered was the battle that had just begun, one man against an entire system, one son protecting his mother. At any cost. The plane was no longer an ordinary plane. It had become something else, an arena of fear and silence, where every passenger's heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo. The son stood in the aisle, tall and unyielding, while his mother's weak breaths scratched the air like broken glass. The flight attendant clutched the inhaler tighter. Though her hand trembled, the captain's voice came over the speaker, calm but heavy. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are aware of a situation in the cabin. Stay calm and everything will be resolved. But the passengers knew. They had seen the truth. The only thing that could resolve this was in the attendant's hand, and she refused to give it back. The son turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the cabin. Every gaze met his, and not one passenger looked away. His presence was no longer just a man protecting his mother. It was something greater, something ancient. The whispers returned, low and fearful. Did you see the lights flicker? He's not normal. Look at his eyes. Something's wrong. The son ignored the whispers. He knelt beside his mother, his hand resting lightly on her chest, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breath. His voice was soft when he spoke, but it carried to every corner of the plane. You are not leaving me. I will not allow it. His mother's frail hand reached up, brushing his cheek. Her lips trembled as she whispered, Please, do not lose yourself for me. But it was already too late. The son could feel the old energy inside him stirring again, a power he had hidden for years. It was buried deep, hidden from the world, but his mother's suffering was calling it out. Flight attendant stepped back, fear finally cracking her mask. She raised her voice, though it shook. Sir, sit down. You are endangering everyone. The son rose again, his full height casting her into shadow. His eyes glowed faintly, the unnatural light returning, stronger this time. Passengers gasped, some covering their mouths, others gripping their seats as if the plane itself might break apart. Endangering? He said slowly, his voice deep, resonant, almost inhuman. No, you endangered her. You endangered this entire flight the moment you touched her life. The attendant tried to call for backup, speaking into her radio, but the device crackled and died in her hand. The lights above flickered again, then dimmed for several seconds before returning. Gasps and shouts rose from the passengers. Some clutched their armrests. A few whispered prayers. The son had not moved his hands. He had not touched a single wire, yet the plane obeyed his anger. The mother coughed violently, her body jerking forward as she struggled for air. The son's expression hardened. He turned back to the attendant, his voice no longer calm but sharp as steel. "You will give it back now." The passengers began to speak louder, voices rising together like a chorus. "Give it back." "She's dying. This isn't right." The attendant's face turned pale. She looked to the other crew for support, but they were frozen in place, fear rooting them to the ground. None dared step forward. The son's hand rose slowly, and the air grew heavy. It pressed against the passengers, against the walls, against the very frame of the aircraft. Some covered their ears, though there was no sound, only a pressure, a weight that came from nowhere. The overhead bins rattled softly, and the windows vibrated as if a storm raged outside. The inhaler slipped slightly in the attendant's grip, her sweaty hand unable to hold it tight. She gasped, clutching it with both hands now, desperate not to lose control. The son's voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "You cannot keep it from her. You cannot keep anything from me." Passengers' eyes widened as the inhaler began to shake in the attendant's hand. She tried to hold it still, but it quivered harder and harder, as though an invisible force was pulling at it. With a cry, she stumbled back, the inhaler slipping from her fingers. But it did not fall. The inhaler hung in the air, suspended, glowing faintly as if caught between worlds. Gasps and screams filled the cabin. A child cried out. A man shouted, and several passengers covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were seeing. The son raised his hand higher, and the inhaler drifted through the air, past the trembling attendant, past the frozen crew, until it landed softly in his palm. Silence fell like a curtain. The son turned back to his mother, kneeling again. He pressed the inhaler into her hand, guiding it gently to her lips. She breathed in, the medicine filling her lungs, her chest rising with desperate relief. The sound of her breath was like thunder after a storm proof that life had returned. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at her son. You should not have." But he only shook his head. "I will always do what I must." The passengers erupted into voices. Some cheered, some wept, some whispered in fear. They had seen something impossible, something beyond human. The attendant collapsed against a seat, her face pale, her authority shattered. Her voice cracked as she whispered, What are you?" The son looked at her, his eyes glowing faintly again. "I am a son. And that is more than enough." The engines roared louder outside, as if answering his words. But inside the cabin, the passengers knew the truth. The flight was no longer in the hands of the crew, nor the captain, nor the airline. It was in the hands of the son. The air inside the cabin was thick with shock. Passengers still stared at the son, their faces pale, their voices low, whispering the same question again and again. "What is he? Did you see that? He didn't touch it. He's not human." The mother leaned back in her seat, her breathing steadier now that the inhaler had returned to her. She closed her eyes for a moment, tears slipping down her cheeks. She was alive, but her heart trembled not from weakness, but from fear of what her son had just revealed. The flight attendant pressed herself against the wall, shaking, her radio still dead in her hand. Her eyes darted to the cockpit door. But she knew it was useless. Whatever power the man carried, it had already silenced the tools she trusted. Her hands curled into fists, but her voice shook when she tried to speak. You can't just take over this plane. You don't know what you're doing." The son turned his head slowly, his glowing eyes dimming just slightly, though the calm in his voice was sharper than any blade. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I am keeping her alive." He turned back to his mother, brushing her hand gently, almost tenderly. His touch was soft, but his presence still carried the weight of a storm. The captain's voice returned on the speaker, firm but uneasy. "Sir, we ask that you return to your seat immediately. Any attempt to control this flight will force us to land and involve the authorities." The son looked toward the front of the plane, his gaze cutting through the locked cockpit door as if he could see the captain himself. "Then land. Land now. Or I will land it for you." A ripple of fear moved through the passengers. Some gasped. Others covered their mouths. The very idea that one man could threaten to ground an entire aircraft was absurd. And yet, after what they had seen, none of them doubted his words. The old woman tried to sit up, her frail hand gripping his arm. "Please don't fight them. I can breathe now, let it go." The son shook his head, his expression tightening. "It is not enough. They humiliated you. They tried to take your life as if it meant nothing. That is something I cannot forgive." The passengers shifted in their seats, torn between fear and admiration. Some wanted him to stop before things grew worse. Others silently cheered him on, their hearts burning with the same anger he carried. The flight attendant finally found her voice again. She pushed herself forward, though her steps were shaky. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're a danger to everyone here. We'll call the authorities, and they'll—" Her words cut off as the son lifted a single finger. The air around her grew heavy, pressing down until her knees buckled. She gasped, collapsing back against the seats, her eyes wide with terror. She could not move. She could barely breathe. The passengers erupted into chaos. Some screamed. Others shouted for help. But the son's eyes glowed brighter now, and his voice carried over the noise. "No one will harm her again, not while I am here." The plane rattled slightly, turbulence shaking the cabin. But the skies outside were calm. Passengers clung to their armrests, realizing the truth. The turbulence was not from the weather. It was from him. The cockpit door unlocked with a sharp click. Gasps filled the air as the door swung open, and the captain stepped out, his face pale but firm. He had never faced anything like this before, but the safety of the flight demanded. "Sir," the captain said, his voice tight. "Whatever is happening here must stop. You are scaring the passengers, and you are threatening this aircraft. If you don't sit down, I will be forced to take action." The son faced him, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim cabin light. "You have already failed your duty. You allowed your crew to strip an old woman of her life. Now you expect me to sit while she suffers? No, this flight is under my command until I say otherwise." The captain clenched his jaw. "You don't command the sky." The son's lips curved in a faint smile, and the plane shuddered again, harder this time. Overhead bins popped open, spilling bags into the aisle. Gasps turned to screams as passengers clung to one another. The son's voice rose, deeper, carrying a force that seemed to echo beyond human hearing. "The sky bends to me if I choose. Do not test me." The captain stumbled slightly, his hands gripping the seatbacks. He had flown through storms, through lightning and winds, but never had he felt the air inside his own plane twist against him. The old woman tried again, her voice weak but desperate. "Son, please, don't let them see you like this." But the son's resolve was unshaken. He turned back to the cockpit, his voice calm once more. "Land this plane, or it will never land at all." Passengers were frozen, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. Some prayed, some stared in awe, some could not look away from the man who seemed more than human. The captain's face hardened. He gave a small nod and retreated back into the cockpit, locking the door behind him. A moment later, the speaker crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an emergency landing." Gasps and cries filled the cabin. Relief for some, dread for others. But one truth was clear. It was not the airline, not the crew, not the captain who had made this decision. It was the son. The announcement of an emergency landing rippled through the cabin like fire. Some passengers cheered in relief, others muttered in fear, and a few sat frozen, still staring at the sun as if he were not human at all. The old woman leaned against her seat, inhaler pressed weakly to her lips, drawing shallow but steady breaths. Her eyes stayed on her son, full of worry. She had seen this side of him before long ago, when danger had forced him to reveal what he truly was. She had begged him then to hide it, to live quietly, to never show the world what lived inside him. And for years he had obeyed. But now, because of her, the truth had returned to the surface. The plane dipped slightly as the pilots adjusted their course. Outside, the sky was calm, but inside the passengers held onto their seats, their hearts racing faster than the engines. The son stood in the aisle, silent now, his eyes watching every movement. He had made his demand, and he would see it carried out. The flight attendant who had taken the inhaler sat trembling near the galley, her face pale, her authority gone. She no longer dared to speak. Every time her eyes met his, she looked away quickly, as though the weight of his gaze was too heavy to bear. A man across the aisle spoke up, his voice carrying the courage of someone who had been silent too long. "What you did, it saved her life. Don't let anyone say otherwise." Another voice followed, then another, until a chorus rose from the passengers. He was right. She needed her medicine. Without him, she would be dead. The son listened but did not answer. Praise meant nothing to him. His only focus was his mother. Yet their words carried across the cabin, strengthening the divide between the passengers and the crew. The people no longer looked at the captain or the flight attendants for safety. They looked only at him. The captain's voice came over the speaker again, strained but firm. "We will be landing in 20 minutes. I ask everyone to remain calm and stay seated. Ground security will be waiting for us." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Security. Authorities. None of them knew what that would mean. Would they try to take the son away? Would they punish him for saving his mother's life? The son tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. He had heard every word. And though his expression remained calm, a flicker of light passed across his skin, like heat shimmering on the horizon. His mother touched his hand, her weak fingers curling around his. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you will not hurt them when we land." He turned his gaze to her, and for a moment, the storm inside him softened. "I will not harm unless they force my hand, but I will not let them take you from me." Never. Passengers leaned closer, listening, sensing. They were caught in something greater than themselves. This was no ordinary flight. This was history unfolding in the skies. The plane descended lower, the engines roaring louder as the ground drew near. Out the windows, city lights began to appear, glowing faintly against the dark horizon. The landing would come soon, but the closer they came, the heavier the cabin felt. Everyone knew the truth. The real fight had not yet begun. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the outside world would clash with the power inside the sun. A child in the back seat whispered to her mother, "Is he a hero?" The mother pulled the child close, her voice hushed. "Maybe, or maybe something more." The son stood tall, his posture unyielding, his hand resting lightly on his mother's shoulder. He closed his eyes briefly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The vibrations of the engines, the heartbeat of the plane, even the whispers of the passengers, all of it folded into his awareness. He was not just a man on a flight anymore. He was its guardian, its judge, its storm. The captain peeked once more from the cockpit door, his face pale, sweat shining on his forehead. He looked at the sun and quickly looked away, closing the door again. The weight of command had slipped from his shoulders the moment this man had stood. Minutes passed like hours. Then the landing gear lowered with a thunderous rumble. The cabin shook and the passengers braced themselves as the runway lights came into view below. The old woman whispered again, her voice trembling, "Son, when we land they will come for you." His eyes opened, calm but fierce. "Let them come. The wheels slammed against the runway, the force shaking every seat. The engines roared as the plane sped down the strip, slowing, until finally the nose tilted downward and the motion eased. They had landed. Passengers cheered, but the joy was cut short as red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane. Armed security waited outside, their dark silhouettes lined against the flashing lights. Gasps filled the cabin. Fear rippled through the passengers again. The flight attendant looked toward the door. Her face pale, relief and dread mixing together. The son remained unmoving. His hand rested gently on his mother's shoulder, his expression calm but unbreakable. His voice carried quietly, yet everyone heard it. This is not their flight anymore. This is mine. And they will not take her from me. The engines wound. Down, the cabin lights dimmed, and outside, the authorities closed in. The storm had landed, but it had not yet passed. Asterisk. The plane had stopped, its engines fading into silence. Outside, flashing lights painted the windows red and blue, shadows of armed men circling the aircraft. Inside, the passengers sat frozen, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting between. The son on the door. The old woman leaned back in her seat, inhaler in hand, her breathing steadier but still weak. She watched her son, her heart full of pride and fear. She knew what was coming. The intercom clicked, the captain's voice strained. Everyone remain seated. Security is preparing to board the aircraft. Please, no sudden movements. The son's eyes narrowed. His hand rested gently on his mother's shoulder, his voice calm but carrying the weight of stone. They will not touch you, the passengers whispered nervously. Some looked toward the door, others back at the son. None dared move. The fear in the air was heavy, but so was something else: anticipation. The cabin door opened with a loud metallic clang. A team of armed officers stepped inside, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind shields and visors. One of them shouted, his voice sharp, "Sir, step away from the woman. Hands where we can see them." The son did not move. His glowing eyes fixed on them, unblinking. The passengers gasped, some crying out in fear, others covering their mouths in awe. The old woman tried to whisper, her frail voice trembling, "Please, don't fight. They don't understand." Her son leaned closer, his voice gentle for her alone. "They don't need to understand. They only need to know." The officer shouted again, "This is your last warning." The son rose slowly, his presence filling the narrow aisle. He did not raise his hands, he did not flinch. His voice rolled through the cabin like thunder. "This flight is mine, she is mine. And no one takes her from me." The lights flickered violently. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing against every passenger's chest. The weapons in the officers' hands rattled as if an unseen force tugged at them. Some passengers screamed, others shouted, "Stop! He saved her life." One officer fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening. The old woman gasped, clutching her chest again, fear flooding her fragile body. And in that moment, the son's restraint broke. The cabin shook as if a storm had erupted inside. The weapons tore from the officers' hands, ripped away by invisible force, slamming into the walls and scattering across the floor. The officers stumbled, thrown backward by a wave of unseen energy. Passengers cried out, covering their heads, some shielding their children, while others simply stared, frozen in awe. The son stood at the center, his eyes blazing bright, his voice echoing deeper than human. "No one harms her again." The officers struggled to rise, but the floor itself seemed to press them down. Their radios cracked and died, their calls for help silenced. The captain inside the cockpit gripped the controls, sweat pouring down his face. He had lost all command. And then, silence. The son lowered his hand. The pressure vanished. The lights steadied. The cabin fell quiet again, though every heart still pounded like thunder. The officers lay scattered but unharmed, their weapons useless. Slowly the passengers began to rise. First one voice, then another, speaking not in fear but in defiance. Not of the sun, but of the system that had nearly killed an old woman. He saved her. She would have died without him. You should be ashamed. The sun turned, his glowing eyes dimming, his presence softening as he looked back at his mother. She stared up at him, tears in her eyes. Please, let this end here. Don't fight the world. Just take me home. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders lowered, the storm inside him fading. He bent down, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "Always, mother. Home is wherever you breathe." He turned to the officers, his voice steady, almost calm again. "You will let her leave this plane. And if you are wise, you will let me leave with her." The lead officer, pale and shaking, nodded quickly. None dared to argue. None dared to test him again. The passengers erupted into applause, loud, defiant, unstoppable. The sound filled the cabin, a wave of human strength rising behind the sun. It was not just fear now. It was respect. It was gratitude. The son helped his mother to her feet, holding her arm gently as they walked down the aisle together. The passengers parted for them, eyes wide, hands clapping, voices shouting. Some wept, some reached out to touch his shoulder. As he passed Dot at the door, the officers stepped aside, their weapons forgotten. The flashing lights outside lit the son and his mother as they stepped onto the stairway. Cameras from the runway caught every moment, though none could explain it. Together, they descended. Together, they walked into the night. And though the world would demand answers, though governments and armies would whisper his name, no one could deny what they had seen. One son had grounded an entire flight. One son had stood against the system. One son had shown the world that nothing, no law, no weapon, no authority was stronger than the bond between a mother and her child.